Hello and welcome. This is video number 6 in a 9-part series about the post-World War II world. And in today's video, the focus is going to be on the creation of the country of Israel. Let's get started. Now, Israel is the country that we're familiar with today. Israel as a country, the way we understand it today, has only been around since 1948. Prior to that, the term most likely used and for the region and for a long period of time was Palestine. And one of the things that's interesting about the creation of the country of Israel and all that's happened since just 1948 is that this is a part of the world that has a lot of significance to different people, religious significance. And unfortunately, one of the things that has come with that over the years, especially in recent decades, has been conflict. Now, as far as religious groups that have connections to this actual region, this specific region, Jews, Muslims, and Christians all have different specific reasons to feel a connection to this place. Now, as far as which groups have lived in this particular area over the years, if we go back several thousand years, we can get evidence and information about a Jewish presence in this region. One of the things that you can note about this area is the location of the original 12 tribes of Israel, which again goes back several thousand years. If you look at the Old Testament of the Bible, it provides a lot of information for these areas and people who lived there and things that took place there. If you look at the picture on the screen, you can see the specific areas where the 12 tribes were located, some bigger areas, some smaller, but the bulk of the areas noted on this particular picture are where the country of Israel is today. So as far as Jews feeling a connection to this particular region, it does go back several thousand years, and it's a very strong connection, and it's one where they feel like this is their homeland, this is their place, this belongs to them. Now, if you move forward in time, you end up having different points in time where one group or another ends up having a more or a less significant influence in the region. Now, as far as Jews were concerned, they were the main presence in that region for a long time, but it was in the 2nd century, so the 100s, by how we note time, Jews were forced out and were pushed out of the region and basically had to find other places around the world to live. This ends up being referred to as something called the diaspora, or this basically a dispersion of the Jews that had at one time lived in this region to find other places to live. One of the things that proved challenging for them is they never were able to reestablish any kind of a homeland for themselves anyplace else, and as a result, they lived in relatively small numbers in many places around the world, and one of the experiences that they had over the centuries was generally poor treatment and persecution, if for no other reason than they were an outside group, a small minority of a population, and sadly, minority groups within any population are more likely to be treated badly. As far as groups that moved in during the 2nd century, Arabs, Christians were coming in by the 2nd century and feeling like that was their place. Muslim groups conquered the region in the 7th century and feel that they've got a connection and a place there. And so putting that all together, the main thing to understand is that there are several different religious groups that feel a strong connection to this particular geographic area and feel that it is in their right to possess it for their group. And it certainly makes it a challenging location if you have several different groups of people that all feel very valid in their claims to a space. Now, if we get closer and closer to the present time, getting into the late 1800s, one thing to note about this place that was called Palestine at that point is it, at that time in the late 1800s, was within and a part of the Ottoman Empire. That will become important here in just a second. But while it was still the Ottoman Empire and still before the World War I years, something called the Zionist movement started to take shape. And basically what the Zionist movement was a desire to create a Jewish homeland for Jews to live in. And the desired location was in what was being called Palestine at that time because of the historical connection to the region. And one of the things that began to take shape in those late 1800s and then into the early 1900s is people who were able to move to that region, Jews who were able to move to that region, were beginning to try to do so. And it was one of those things where in the beginning it was not necessarily too big a deal, nothing really more specific than land was for sale in Palestine. Some Jewish families with the ability to buy land were doing that. Transactions took place. Had new people living in Palestine. Now, as more and more people began to move into Palestine, more and more Jewish people began to move in, momentum did build for an actual Jewish state to take place there. Now, getting to the World War I years and getting near the end of the World War I years, as World War I was winding to a close, thoughts were circulating about what to do with some of this territory that, in particular, with what we're talking about today, was in what had previously been held by the Ottomans. And because one of the things that happens with the end of World War I is the Ottoman Empire ceases to exist, and a lot of the territory that they held at that point they lose. Now, Palestine would end up being effectively in British hands to oversee that place moving forward as an independent place. And one of the things that comes out is a request for there to be a Jewish state. And so a statement that comes out, and I've got the statement on the screen there, was something called the Balfour Declaration, where it appeared that, at least at this point, Great Britain was supportive of the idea of a Jewish state. And I'll read through a portion of this. It says, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. All right, so this wasn't saying it was going to happen or not going to happen, but basically just expressing an openness to this idea of a Jewish state. Now, nothing more would really go with that over the next couple of decades, but then World War II happens, and that ends up being really significant for momentum for a Jewish state. As you know, with World War II, the Holocaust was a devastating aspect of that for lots of people, especially Jews. And so the general feeling among many countries of the world was sympathy for Jews, and the time with this newly created United Nations was right, at least in the minds of many around the world, to go ahead and create a Jewish homeland. Palestine was clearly the location that made sense for this to take place in the minds of many. And the General Assembly ended up voting to create a Jewish homeland. And basically what it was going to be was a dual state where a portion of it would be for the Palestinians and a portion of it would be for Jews. Now, the city of Jerusalem would be designated an international city where nobody had control over it one way or the other. And there you go. That's how that was supposed to be. In fact, the picture on the screen shows what the partition plan of Palestine was supposed to look like. And you can see that the yellow areas were supposed to be the Palestinian areas. The more orange color was supposed to be the Jewish areas. And there you go. Now, as far as the voting in the General Assembly was concerned, though the voting was such that it passed, none of the Islamic countries in the world, and in particular the neighbors around Palestine, voted in support of this. So one thing that happened is, even though Israel was officially created on May 14th, 1948, this now new country, Israel, was completely surrounded by enemies, effectively. And Palestine in particular did not recognize this Jewish state as real and valid. And so it was off to a rocky start, and then things get worse from there. The very next day after Israel was proclaimed a state, 6 neighboring countries end up attacking Israel: Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and Syria. Now, in a relatively short amount of time, Israel would prove victorious in this initial attack, but it would not be the last time there was conflict in the region and that Israel was at war with its neighbors. Now, when you look at some of the conflict over the years, you can place blame in some cases on Israel. You can place blame in some cases on other places, and people will certainly even dispute whether it was one or the other in all of the conflicts. At any rate, what we have seen since Israel was created was a place where, from time to time, there ends up being conflict. There continues to not be an acceptance by some of this idea of this Jewish state existing, and it's really kind of hard to imagine that the future won't continue to be one that's more or less filled with conflict. And so, at least as this relates to the Cold War years that we've been looking at, this country was created early in the time after World War II. It was one of the first things the newly created United Nations did, and it has definitely been a significant place in the world ever since. And with that, it's, I think, worthy of taking a day to learn a little bit more about that. Well, I hope you have found this video to be informative and helpful to just gaining a little bit more knowledge and insight into the country of Israel. Thanks for watching.